And so now Giuseppe Milan will introduce the webinar. So thank you, Benedetta. And a warm welcome to everybody. I could also say good day, but also good evening, because many of you are following from Asia. And so a warm welcome to everyone who's participating. I'm very happy to be here with you. And in particular, I salute Suzanne, Archbishop Zan. So there will be 5 webinars, 5 appointments organized by Sophia. You will find in the invite that will be shown to you, sent to you, the titles of the speakers of these 5 webinars. So I won't take too long to present them in detail. However, they will talk of an initiative of Sophia, which is also in a close collaboration with EDU, which is Education Unity, which is founded by Chiara Lubik, which is at an international level and is it's diffused through the world and looks at different researchers on education report with her work in opera and thought. So I'd like to underline the importance that Sophia gives to the formation in a strict link with the Global Compact on Education, which is an educative pact, which many know from Pope Francis, which is this big challenge of the educational pact or oath. And through this course that I'll present to you today, I would try to give an insight into this. So for now, I will leave the word to Giuseppe, who is the president of Sophia. So thank you, a big thank you to everybody, to Professor Milan and Archbishop Zani. I would just simply like to express my applause for this initiative, for the group of professors and the human sciences, and particularly from Pedagogy of Education. So this Pedagogy of Communion and Culture of Peace, as has already been said, the educative question is today a fundamental question in contemporary society. So we can't ignore it, and it's very important that it is confronted in an adequate way. Sophia would like to really take on this project to work towards this task, and they're doing so together with many other universities on this Global Compact on Education that Pope Francis has launched. And so, this is a educative reality that the Pope does from his particular point of view, which is of a communion, which wants to be lived and experiences at all levels. The relationship between life and thought, in the relationship between disciplines, in the interdisciplinary, in the transdisciplinarity, which today we really feel a lot of need for. So thank you to my colleagues from the human sciences for having launched this project at Sophia, to have really launched it today through this group, through this system, let's say, of a webinar. And so a greeting from Sophia, from the whole academic community at Sophia, for our satisfaction for this initiative, and with a particular greeting to those who have been tasked with giving their contribute. So speakers here today who we will welcome with great joy. So thank you very much for your contributions, and we will listen with lots of pleasure, and then a big salute to everybody who's living and participating in this event. A big thank you. So thank you to our director. So I will present now a synthesis to this course teaching that's been feeded to me, Pedagogy of Communion. Excuse me. I'm just interrupting to ask if you can just give a little bit on the structure of our webinar so we can organize. I will just offer a bit on the structure. So thank you to everybody, which has really called for a bit of a core of a heart and of okay, so we were just talking about the different things behaviors that we'll need or what will happen in this webinar. So at the conclusion of 2 interventions, we'll have a talk of Archbishop. Okay, so for this reason, everybody who's following the webinar will be able to propose questions through the channel questions and answers, or in the bar of comments at the bottom of the screen. So these, okay, so questions posed in the chat won't be taken into consideration. That's simply for technical considerations. So in the movement of dialogue at the end, you can okay, so using that channel of questions and answers. Okay, so now is the way to submit your questions. Passing to Giuseppe Mulan. Okay. So you can also see that, you know, for an old professor in front of many people in front of me, sometimes we forget what we have to do. So thank you for, and I will start to present the Pedagogy of Communion, which is this course that I've been assigned, so which makes up a part of the master's course of a culture of unity and the specialization of Pedagogy of Communion for culture of peace. So this course, and so talking of this course, I will be referring to this thing that makes the base of our communal base, which is the thought and a work of Chiara Lubick, seen in a pedagogical perspective. I have to say that Chiara Lubick didn't leave a unitary specific treatment on education, that is a systematic pedagogy. Instead, she left a great deal of writings, of experiences, of educational proposals, of structures that can refer to the field of education within a vision that is coherent and original. So we can talk of a pedagogy of communion using a terminology that she herself used and suggests. Indeed, precisely human being as an authentic relationality, as communion, social life as communion, but also the macro perspective of humanity as communion. So these are key ideas of Chiara that she proposes, that calls forth the essential task of education, the idea of communion easily approaches the idea of education seen as process, as transformative practices of improvement that are never fully concluded, and the human beings report to the others, to the community, to the world, to God. To be in the world in communion with others. So in this perspective, the idea of communion is used also by many other important pedagogists, educationalists. For example, the great Brazilian pedagogist Paulo Freire, who has been universally recognized and is a contemporary of Chiara, born in 1921, who already in her opera, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, has inserted precisely that concept of communion as a foundation for his pedagogy. Humans educate themselves in communion, as is a citation from Freire. So, however, it's clear that every terminology, every term always then is explained, because also in the various cultural contexts that it becomes interpreted and translated, but always in order to stay faithful to this original significance. We know well that together with pedagogy of communion, other definitions can be coherent with the thought of Chiara, for example, pedagogy of unity or pedagogy of fraternity. But beyond these terminological questions, what are the foundational or the fundamental characteristics of a pedagogy of communion? Evidently, we can just only indicate them here in an extreme synthesis. And I'll draw them from the lecture that Chiara gave at Washington in November 2000, in occasion of her honorary master's in Pedagogia, which was received from the Catholic University. A lecture in which Chiara affirmed, and I cite, "Our movement and our history can be seen as a big, extraordinary event, educational event, presented to us are all the factors of education. And it's even evident the presence of a theory of education, that is a well-delineated pedagogy that founds our educative action." The lecture itself, even in this synthesis, is certainly a lesson of pedagogy, because like every authentic and complete pedagogical discourse takes into consideration the fundamental elements of education, that is a journey path with its starting point and arrival point. Chiara herself asks in synthesis, what is education? And she affirms that this is the itinerary of the educating subject, individual or community, is fulfilled with the help of the educator or educators, with a have to, a need, an end which remains valid for both the human and for humanity. So the lecture is truly a profound reflection on a point of a starting point, that of reality with all its difficulties, its limits, its failings, its educational needs, and the reality that is itself present. The second point is the arrival point, the end point that we are going towards, which is the finality, the end, which can also be defined as a utopia, that is an island that doesn't yet exist, but which could and should exist. That is the horizon of values, of educational goals. So the third point is the path, the journey, which is the method, the how of education. So I have to say that Chiara often uses this pedagogical language, this typical specific articulation of reality, finality, and method. For example, in her discourse for the 1996 UNESCO Prize for Education to Peace, but also in the highly regarded writing of 1949, The Resurrection of Rome. All in all, these many foundational writings, but also in many public discourses given in occasion of important events, Chiara presents what we can define as her founded, coherent pedagogy, precisely in the strict and coherent articulation of reality, finality, and methods. So now, the first point, to look in the face of reality. For Chiara, what does it signify? What does it mean? It means to look at the deepest difficulties of human beings, the difficulties of the human community, which, as we know, this is the important point for her. For her, is Jesus forsaken? Is Jesus forsaken? To search, to recognize, to listen, to love precisely that human that is suffering. He is the figure of the needy, of the misfit, of the unloved, of the neglected, of the marginalized, of all those human and social experiences for which there is an urgent and special need for education. Jesus forsaken is the paradigm for who losing everything, has need for someone who gives him everything and does everything for him. He indicates to us, therefore, the limit without limits of each need, the limit without limits of our responsibility to help and to educate. So the discourse of around pedagogy of communion is founded on this gaze of the abandoned, of the abandon of the world, of the love for the world that is to die for your own people. And so it highlights precisely that which isn't in communion, that which we don't want to see, the part of the world and of life that is discarded from the present and from history. This is the starting point of our pedagogy. The second point, what is the end? What is the finality of this pedagogy? So I am citing Chiara ancora again. We work for unity, for that end of ends, expressed in the prayer and testament of Jesus, that all may be one. The utopia reality for which we intend to dedicate our lives. And these are always words of Chiara. This seems a utopian project, but every authentic pedagogy is the bearer of of a utopian tension, of education in each perspective is seen as the means to get closer to a utopian end. And in this perspective, the end is always the purpose assigned to education to form man, to form his autonomy, which is made explicit almost paradoxically in forming man in relation, a relational man, relational human. Okay, so the whole experience of Chiara is a putting in practice of these methodological courses. So Chiara talks of technical techniques, pedagogical techniques of graduality and of completeness of fulfillment, of education towards the difficult, to see the difficult, the obstacles, trials, tasks, errors, failing, pain as something to be affronted, to confronted, to love, to overcome. So a sociality that is more authentic, where we put into practice and we activate a marvelous synthesis between a pedagogical instance of education of the individual and a pedagogical instance of the construction of the family, of the community. So a society founded on authentic democratic relationships with educative practices of reciprocal love, of living the communitarian experience in small groups. So to be an educator signifies to live with the highest intensity the interpersonal relationships with others, practicing empathy, acceptance, hope, and educational fight. All of this, we know, has been synthesized in many different writings of Chiara, but in particular, the art of loving. The art of loving is a very important synthesis of these of this advice that she gives us and of this methodology. So we know that at the end of 1972, Chiara prophetically proposed an idea which today is very actual and very relevant, and that is she defines the global man, global citizen. That is the intercultural human capable of dying for its own people and to love the entirety of humanity. This global man, global citizen indicates the necessity of this epochal, historic passage of culture, which for much time was closed off to global dialogue. So today, instead, UNESCO and these big international institutions speak of a global citizenship education. This is a perspective that Chiara launched 50 years ago. And some of you in that 1972, that may have been there with that perspective, which has a very beautiful story. So on these themes, naturally, we construct the pedagogy of communion. So evidently, all of this then becomes actualized, and in a close relationship with the needs of this changing of epocha, of which Pope Francis has talked, and with an extreme attention to the fact that we're talking of an education that is lifelong, and an education that calls forth the essential protagonism of young people, of intergenerational relationality, the fundamental importance of the family, of schools, of this alliance between institutions. All are called, everyone is called to be a protagonist in this global contact on education. To finish, I want to say something important. Not that what I have already said isn't important, but I want to finish with this. All of this, we don't really construct with our hands. It's a project that is so big, so much bigger than us, that there's a need, just as Chiara says, for a teacher, for a master with a capital T, that he is the first secret of an authentic communion between us, of an authentic unity, and that he guides us in this path. Okay, so I would like to thank from my heart Professor Giuseppe Milan for this talk, in which we can already intuit a bit from this new pedagogy, which is ontological, philosophical, and which is able to start from the abandonment. And so I would like to thank again and pass the word to the Professor Araceli, and who will intervene with her point of teaching on pedagogy of the person and of the community. So now Araceli says thank you for everyone for being present and for welcoming this, and I welcome this invitation, and thank you to Professor Milan for this fascinating presentation, which really brings forth the desire, the wish to keep on going with this course. And so I would also like to just simply do a brief description of the course which I'm occupied with, that I give at Sophia. And I say sorry from the beginning for my Italian, and I will be reading from a document I already prepared. So giving a bit of the history of this course. So it was in the second half of 2014 that began this first course of pedagogy of the person and of the community. And in this way, it was opened new fields of research to the University Institute of Sofia. And before this course, there were no courses in the field of education. So with Mr. Zani, this means Your Excellency Zani, this was born, who's also provided a push towards this possibility to open the door of Sophia to education. From that moment, it became officially inserted into the academic offerings of Sophia, the educational perspective that bases itself on this premise, that we all must think of ourselves as inserted into a constant educative process for the whole arc of our lives, aware that education is a process which is always in action. So the goal of this first course is essentially was essentially to give a way for the maximum number of students and professionals interested, who were interested in this theme, to approach a discipline that has usually been reserved to restricted circles, and which instead it's urgent that it can contribute and be presented in its breadth and profound educational value. So this discipline is thought not only for teachers, but for everyone, and therefore being aware that education makes up a part of our being in the world as a continuous act of rediscovery of our identity, of our being educators, each of us towards the other, a discipline that is for everyone, that is because we are constantly educating ourselves. So this course, right from the first years, which intends to develop an attention towards a discipline for everyone, which are the words of Michele Di Bene, and with whom I had the fortune of sharing the teaching for the first academic years, and always using the words of Professor Di Bene. The starting point of our work is the awareness that education, that representative education, is the true treasure of humanity, and which signifies that even that fundamental search for sense that every person dedicates themselves to, young or less young, becomes an act of continuous discovery of our own identity. So in this context, and starting from a synthetic approach of the fundamentals of general pedagogy and of educational relationality, this course takes us to two particular fields of applied pedagogy. One regards the processes of teaching and of valuation, learning and valuation that we refer to also in the working environment. The other is education in adult life or lifelong learning, and to arrive to offer a few lines of orientation for the development of a pedagogy of unity. So according to the philosophy of indicated by the so according to the philosophy indicated by the process of Bologna, and according to the so through the didactic objectives, we have to put a central importance on the valorization of reflexivity and the active participation of students to their own processes of learning. In fact, in lessons, we underline many aspects regarding the diverse dynamics of the group, which are in continuing interactions and all the continuing interactions between teachers and students. So in the concrete, the course bases itself on the principles of solidarity service learning, which will also be presented in one of the next webinars, as a method and as a transmission of content and competences to acquire. So expectations that have a lot to do with the characteristics, those key characteristics of teaching at IUS. So in this context, the challenges that over a long time faced us is the profound fragmentation of the disciplines and the sense of estrangement that often is an obstacle to academic work in the educational field. So the experience of Sophia has pushed us right from the beginning to establish this course as a sort of laboratory of dialogue, to know ourselves, to exchange themes and perspectives of research, didactic practices and innovative proposals that in the classroom find space and are welcomed. And in fact, this course is enriched every year through the fact of students having many diverse backgrounds and arriving with their own academic formation. And so they are bearers of many different, they bring with them many different expectations, motivations, and interests for this area of study, which perhaps more than others really marks this strong occasion, moment of interdisciplinarity, which really disciplinarity, which really characterizes the entire formative and educational offer of Sophia. So it's a discipline which is offered as a place of dialogue with the other areas of specialization and with the different scientific and cultural experiences that animate the academic space of Sophia. So thank you, Benedetta. I would also like to thank the professor, and reminding us that this is always a process in action, ongoing, and that we are always at the same time educators and those being educated. And that this is really both interdisciplinary and intercultural. So I would like to rethank Professor Arachale, and instead pass the word to Your Excellency Vincenzo Zanni.
Thank you, Benedetta. I'd like to thank everybody, the director, professors who already spoke, and a very warm greeting to everybody who is following and listening. The two talks that were just being given were very stimulating and rich. So I will start a bit from my contact with the experience of Sophia, and also this content material that's already been touched on. I believe that the University Institute of Sophia, the last creation produced decidedly by Chiara as an academic reality to promote and to develop the culture of unity, cannot and absolutely must not lack the pedagogical field. Even more so, it must be written right into the DNA of everything that has been born from the heart of Chiara and the work of Mary. And above all, from this institution of superior studies, which was approved by Chiara and was wanted by Chiara, inasmuch as it is one of the principal places of cultural mediation of the charism of unity, that novelty which it brings to the whole world of academic world and of thought and of experience. So this is very important, above all, for the communication of this richness to the young generations, which, as Chiara's always told which is already held as the only master with a capital M, that founded this light of wisdom, that Sophia has to be the principal instrument to receive it and to go in depth on it and to elaborate the teachings which from this master come to us through this experience of Chiara, of the spirituality before everything else, is a spirituality that illuminates intelligence and wisdom. So between the texts that have always also touched me very much, and which have already been cited very well by Professor Milan, and that which I would like to refer to bring forth, and is precisely that lecture of Chiara at the Catholic University of Washington in 10th of November in 2000, which is a very important text, which seems to me precisely a manifesto of the Pedagogy of Communion, a synthesis of many different elements that she cites in other speeches, which we've already referred to. Here I would find 5 major points, which I would consider the pillars, the most important passages in this pedagogical approach of Chiara already cited before. So first of all, the concept of education. There's a very clear concept of education, from one you can see already in this history of pedagogy, and in a certain extent, there's not a whole lot of novelty in this, but there is an approach that brings together a whole range of elements in an original way. As Chiara says in her definition, when she says that education is an itinerary, is a journey, an itinerary that a subject completes with help, not by themselves, but with help. So walking together with the others towards an end, which we consider valid, not just for him, not for that person, but for everybody, for the entire community, for the entire humanity. So there's certainly a very broad and rich dimension to this. And we are in the principle of the history of pedagogy, but it seems to me that here Chiara wants to respond to the educative emergency of today, which has exploded in the last 10 years, characterized in part by the profound structural and cultural changes. In this emergence, we find a new demand for communication, a more complicated demand and complex demand for education. We expect and ask for an even higher professional competence, a pedagogical competence, but also didactic, but also together with scientific. So in this emergence, we find a new demand, a new question of education, and for a more complex demand for education, which also brings in this question of artificial intelligence and the challenge it brings, which is emerging above all in these last years. Have to know how to unify the instances of personal formation with a democratic and social formation, with humanism and personalism, but also with the social and global dimension. So it seems to me that here, effectively, there's a capacity of Chiara to reassume and to bring together in her definition elements which are brought together. So it's a dynamic itinerary which accompanies each person towards a new humanity. The second element, which seems important to take from the interventions, especially the one of Washington, and which in all of her references to pedagogy have another phase, which is the point of the spirituality of Chiara, which she experienced and launched. So in this second point, it's very strong, in my opinion, the way she is inspired by the spirituality of communion, which is the discovery of the centrality of God as Father and as love, which seems this spiritual, faraway discourse, which has nothing to do with the pedagogy, but is actually fundamental, because which refers to the presence of the unique, of the soul educator, which helps to give light to the whole question of education, which is present in all roles and all contexts of education. And so here the discourse touches the family, schools, the community, the cultures, every field, free time, the social life. And here in that discourse, Chiara does a very important passage. So before or in the face of a culture where we eclipse the figure of the father, where it is less important, what we could call the loss of authority on the level of human relationships, and so the crisis of rules and of life in our relationships, which we can call a moral relativism. There are no longer points that we refer to. So in this sense, God as love becomes a great light, and a basic principle on which we can base unity and communion. So this is a very important passage because it's very actual, in the sense that the problem that Chiara emphasizes, evidence is a critical factor, and which we can show everywhere, that we can synthesize as the crisis of reports and relationships between generations. A crisis, not a conflictual crisis today like it was before, but a deeper crisis which takes with it the themes of authority and freedom, two fundamental principles in the educative process. And they are crises, very strong moments, which today we talk about in this crisis of the relationships between generations, which we call in the culture of today as an adolescent culture that is of a certain uncertainty, to not know where to go and what direction to take oneself. So in this crisis, we could say that the difficulty, that discomfort, and that's worse, is not that of the young person, of the adolescent, but of the adult. And in this crisis, we can say that the difficulty and the discomfort, educative discomfort, is not that of the young people, but of adults. It's adults in difficulty in transmitting to young people certain values that have taken them into crisis themselves. So it's a very concrete, very actual discussion, which then touches precisely what we were saying before, is the reality. The reality of today is this. It's made up of these darks and lights, these shadows, these uncertainties and doubts, this incapacity to know how to decide where to go. And so we arrive at the third point, which is the theme of moral education, which is a very important question, because on this ground, the discourse links with education, with moral education, and which is always at the center of the tension of educators, because the educative flows has an ethical value, exercises, that is, a certain influence, which is even imperceptible, of the moral life of the person being educated. So every gesture, every moment can be formative or deformative. And so here is a central point of the educational process, and the theme of moral development, which conditions the pedagogical discussions and which links very easily in the philosophical field, but which also has an anthropological imposition we can't negate, or we can't dialogue, without having an anthropological vision. As Chiara says, educating means to complete an itinerary, a journey with an end in order to arrive at that end, we need to know where to go. And so we insert, which Chiara calls, the rule of graduality, which is to accompany the person, to help them to mature and to grow and to decide. There aren't external impositions, but to grow from within the conscience of who is that person, and at the same time of others. And so we arrive at the fourth point, which is the theme of the relational dimension. So education passes through relations of relationality. So here, Chiara proposes a sort of systemic model in which recognizing the ontological priority of relationships, which is realized through the spiritual dimension, the rapport with transcendence, with God, with the absolute, but also with the other person, with alterity. And so relationship isn't present just in its dimension of a relationship between people, but the relationship is so important that when it is experienced, the relationship itself takes on and becomes a regenerative dimension. It has a value in of itself. It's the third element of a relationship, the true generative moment. And so that's what Chiara says from the spiritual point of view is Jesus in our midst. And so this is the proximity of God to others, to love our neighbor, which is the expression of the idea of infinity that exists in every human being. And that is for the more or less conscious relationship that every man has with God. And so here this seems very important because for Chiara, the educational relationship isn't based on a didactic principle, but a triadic principle. There's always an element of novelty, of newness, where one loses to make space for the other, and vice versa. And so if this occurs, there we have a true relationship, a true triadic relationship. And education, therefore, has a true generative dimension to it. And that tertium, that third dimension that is born in this true relationship between two people. The last point, which I would like to share, and as obviously Chiara has said, the educational process isn't a passage or an itinerary that doesn't have obstacles. Absolutely not. It's an encounter of numerous difficulties which can be understood with a spiritual counterpart, the concept of Jesus forsaken, who is apparently failing, but through that failing is able to bring about a new scenario. And so the human being, we know in their personal life, in their relationships, must always measure himself with the limits which make up part of human nature, this imperfect nature. Everybody encounters their limits. Everybody carries with them the wounds, and which we've seen with the pandemic. Many of these wounds have exploded, and some people haven't been able to resist them, and has sort of renounced themselves in front of this. So the limits, they reveal the insecurities of people, and where they've lost their points of referral and experience a reduction of liberty, of movement, of action, of contact. So in the Latin language, we have two terms to indicate the limit. One is the term finis, which underlines the boundaries of a region, which separates it from everything else. But there's another term as well, limen, which this boundary isn't connotated as that which closes and finishes, but that which opens. So the limit signifies a new chance. The limit means an opening, in other words. Everything that Chiara refers to, this unity that is born from entering wholly to the depths of this limen. And so we can think of this horizon before us as a line, a limit that is constantly producing something beyond itself. So the limits of the human person that we experience, this limis, the boundaries of a person, also illuminates the new spaces for intelligence, spirituality, and creativity that continuously awaken this passage, which renews, which creates this space of alterity. So on the base of this consideration, which is just a repetition of some things that have already been said, we have to remind ourselves to the limits of the human person, which they experience as an end, as a finis, the sense of delineating its conditions, and is also at the same time limina, in the sense that those are spaces for a new life, a new intelligence, a spirituality, a creativity, which continually awakens this ethical passage, which helps us become better, which renews and grows, and which is alterity. And so on the basis of these considerations, which are just a repetition of some things that have already been said, we have to keep ourselves in relation with others to develop, alongside the Institute of Sophia, courses that are interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary of human sciences and of the pedagogical sciences. So that's the point through which, from one part, we can always put value on the experience that's been done in these years. On the other side, I believe that there must be a source for studies already being conducted into this very actual issue. So to go ahead and collect all of these seeds of a pedagogy that's already in act, and which can become points of referral for this new pedagogy. So Pope Francis issued in 2007 the Apostolic Constitution of Veritas Gaudium on the academic institutions, which refers to the Church and therefore also Sophia. And so in this document, the institutions are invited to be laboratories, cultural laboratories, which are able to work on new paradigms to help emerge in this epochal change, in this anthropological and environmental crisis, where, affirms Pope Francis, they can affirm a joyous cultural revolution. So I would say that these things, what have already been affirmed in these last years, is exactly a courageous cultural revolution which passes through the pedagogical field. Thank you.
Thank you very much to His Excellency Vincenzo Zani. So these are the keys to help us understand this education, which today can say has been quite wounded, to start from an education of relationships as has been cited. So I would like to thank again very much so our speakers, and open our discussion at this point, giving the words to all of those who are following to join in our dialogue. And I remind you to the methods of interacting in the webinar on YouTube. It's possible to give questions on the channel of questions and answers, or through the chat that has just been activated. So if someone would like to take the word to say something, there's a need to ask and to register. And it's also possible to ask questions via the chat on YouTube, so we can open up our discussion. In the meantime, that we're waiting for who will give us some questions and that we can take them. And I would have a question for Professor Milan and His Excellency Zani. So to the Professor Milan, I thank you again. I really liked that you talked of this new origin of a pedagogy, and this space of the abandoned, of those who experience difficulties, to say with the words of Chiara, and that we've already talked of a way to respond to this, talking about empathy. So I would ask Professor to talk a bit more about this theme of empathy, which often gets left aside, but must be a proper point of a starting point for us. So instead, the question I would like to give to His Excellency. So you spoke of a triadic relationship, which has Jesus in the midst, and therefore which rethinks the relational dichotomy from this triadic point of view, referring to the Trinity. So I ask myself, maybe, is it necessary to challenge, to have a synergy of disciplines, of wisdom, of a new pedagogy, but also to rethink the way, to have a posture of the way we think about philosophy and anthropology and these other disciplines, which already at Sophia are also already challenged by this discussion of ontologia trinitary ontology. So Giuseppe Masan is asking, so he will respond first. So it's a great question and complicated question that would imply would need a very articulated response. So I would say that empathy is the essential thing that we need to have in order to understand others, but really even to understand the world, because we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the world, which is also other people's and other cultures. So we live a possibility of understanding if we have this competence of understanding the others that I often close off, but in order to truly encounter the other. So as we often say in our common language, to put ourselves in the other's shoes, to see the world as the other sees it, or as another culture sees it. And so on this, there have already been many great thinkers who have written and reflected, above all in the philosophical field on this. Edith Stein, for instance. In psychology, Carl Rogers. In Pedagogia, also many, which recognize the importance of this journey, the importance of this participation, and the importance that easily we forget of distance, which separates us from the other. A meeting always implies a voyage and a distance. The awareness that the other is another and that I am me. So the relationality, which we've already talked about, implies the awareness of this alterity. So saying this, the fact itself, to put myself in the other's shoes and to see the world with the eyes of another, permits me, and this often we don't truly welcome, to see myself from another point of view and to welcome in myself dimensions that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to. So from a meta perspective to ourselves, it allows us to awaken and to understand our meta identity of ourselves. So through empathy, we construct something new of our identity. And so this journey, and with many others, we live a type of cycle, empathetic circle, this circularity, interpretation of circularity. Through many other eyes, I see many different points of view, and I understand many other realities of myself that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So allowing me to respond to the question, who do I want to be? So empathy is one of the biggest human competencies that really requests our humanity, and our humanity requests us to have. So thank you very much. And I don't have any other questions to give you. So I'll pass the word to His Excellency. So thank you for this question. That's very provoking and interesting. And just as Milan says, it would really merit an entire discourse. And I hope in the application of this discipline, we'll found it on these questions, because it's something that can be shown through by Sophia. So I'd say the triadic relationship, Trinity, refers to the Trinity. So it's a theological discourse, but it's a theological discourse that then becomes anthropological. So according to the Christian revelation that man was made in the image of God, in the similarity of God, in this Trinity, is the foundation of the relationship. This is the point. So we can't we can't underrate. It's the base. So this is at every level of the relationships, of feelings, of relationships, of thoughts, of reasoning, rationality. So I believe that at this point, from this point of view, we go back to the earlier discussion of the idea of God as love and God as Father, because man made in the likeness and image of God is not done as a father, but as a son, as a person that is in relation with the other who gives him life. And so it's the theory of filiality, of being a son, even from the point of a psychological point. We aren't born a father, we're born a son. So we already have to put ourselves in a relationship with another. And here we already put ourselves in the camp of different fields of philosophical, theological, but also psychological. So in being children, we have something that arises from another, and which I then share through brotherhood, through with our siblings. So who is a brother? But I'm responsible for my brother, for my sibling. So it's the foundation of ethics, even. So at the same time, I am also given entrusted with the world and the history of the world, where I leave the impression of my reality, of my existence. So is in this being a son. So every relation can either be egoistic, generated by this more egoistical vision where I am at the center of the world, or one that puts into evidence the other. But even more so, that space that exists between me and the other, which is the space of growth. And that is the triadic approach. So I enter and I give all of that I know and put myself at the disposition of the other. In this way, it's a service. It's not an imposition, and therefore creating a space in which the other can grow. So I don't give it's not a lesson at Sophia. When you do a lesson here, you're transformed, because the triadic relationship, it generates something, it creates something in a child or in a student, anyone who has taken this lesson. And so in this way, it's a regenerating the relationship. So as you said, Benedetta, this also is true for the different disciplines, not just people. And that's why the interdisciplinary approach, but not just, but also transdisciplinary approach, this relation of space between disciplinaries and different disciplines, it's an approach of relationality, which is always more open, of one's own knowledge and discipline, and to share their knowledge. And so I think this is essential, and this must be the point of Sophia, to enter then into the knowledge of another discipline. So to knowing doesn't just mean a positional presence where I go and take something and to affirm and to my position and my knowledge, but in order to put it at the service of another, to develop even more this service towards the others. I want to know how to dialogue with the other. So taking on another's knowledge in order to dialogue and create, and to, instead of accumulating this knowledge and disciplines for oneself, but to enter into them, not in a discipline, but in many disciplines, that then becomes the foundation for a new form of knowledge. I don't know if I gave a response, but it was an attempt. Absolutely, yes, His Excellency, and it seems like a very beautiful synergy of all of the different contributes. There's a really nice melody synthesis between the different contributors. So now I would pass the word. Okay, so we've managed to take some questions for the different collaborators. So I would call Alejandra, who would like to propose a question. Hi. So this question refers to Professor Milan. So it comes from two people, from Fernandel. So the question first place says, to what does the professor refer to when he speaks of a method of practices for reciprocity? And another wrote in English. He is a young person that it is difficult as a young person to go ahead with the difficulties of which Chiara also talked of. So the question for Professor Milan is, how can we take these difficulties of reading, of these cultural difficulties forward, of which you talked to? So thank you, Alejandro. And so I'll pass the word straight away to Professor Milan. Okay, so the reciprocity is one of the, how to say, dimensions of the fundamental methodology of education. The other is, however, never passive. It's never a reality that has to be subservient. It's a communication, but not a unilateral communication, but it's always implied in a dialogue. From the moment a baby is born, the messages that they give have to be listened to. And there are many different ways and that expresses itself, and I have to listen to him, of course, from the beginning. But among human beings, there's a an asymmetric relationality. There's someone who has more power and more competency, but that doesn't mean that they are worth more from the point of view of human importance. From this point, it's not, we can't measure this, it's not unthinkable. But in the imposition of the higher point of more power, has to give power, has to give the word. It has to give space and protagonism and knowledge. This gradually, step by step, is a relationship that, if I have the word and I am an educator, have to give the word, give the space to another. If I'm an organization in a certain context, I have to give the leading, the being boss of the organization to someone else. So this is always within a reciprocity, which makes power pass from the competency of one person to another, from a master or teacher to allow another to become a teacher and a master. So the function of a worker in a company or an organization is paradoxically to make the role of a manager in an organization is to allow the workers to have their competence, almost to turn around, to rotate this relationship. The other becomes my father. The other becomes my master. Children will become fathers of their fathers. This is a quote. So some of the big figures of literature had some clear ideas of what this relationality was like. So we're talking of reciprocity. Of Chiara Lubick has always taught us that education is in reality relationality between us, and this reciprocity between us can only be relationality, and that's what constructs what was already been said, the creativity, this third dimension that we construct between us. Sorry, so the other challenge and the cultural challenge for young people, and really for just any human being today, implies, according to me, so fundamental things come to mind. We have to study, we have to research, we have to know the experiences of the other. And all of this, we have to try to do it together. in dialogue with diversity. So this cultural challenge, which is also ethics, existential, they're not challenges that we can confront by ourselves with our own plans and restricted journeys, but in that dimension, that contextual dimension where we are many different people in contexts that communicate and counter each other, so this supervision of super community will enable us to overcome many difficulties. So we have to work together to try and find this interdisciplinarity, which is an interdialogicalness, an dialogue between us. And there are many different concepts that we can link to this. So thank you very much to Professor Millen for this, which calls back to the relationality. So I will now pass the word to Professor Gaudiano. So I will propose a question, and I'm following here the chat of YouTube. So a question arrived to Professor Aratelli. As a teacher at a university, what has been the experience of teaching in this context and this pedagogical context, which is a particular pedagogical context like that at Sophia? So thank you for the question. It's an interesting question that I have many times asked myself, or reflected on, because every time, and from a number of years that I have been doing this experience at Sophia, arriving from my university and then the Sophia experience, and then turning back to my university at the end of the course. Certainly today, these two aren't comparable, these two models of university. What do I find in my university, even it is a good university, I can also say that the Faculty of Education, at least in this moment, as a human quality has a value, even if it's a public university, it has a body of teachers, of professors, which is in the major part are occupied also with human formation. And so not just for transmitting content to students, but also for research and to form the formation of teachers and professors that help with. So I have to say that there's a big difference that every time I experienced the different experiences from the first year, which was really a slap in the face almost, like I'm also, because I had within my hands a professional experience, but also a life experience, which I had done with the students at Sophia, that I didn't know how I could translate it in something similar with my students, my own university. So I'll just give an example. Usually I have courses with a lot of students, 50, 60 students per group. And every semester I have more or less 200 students altogether for that semester. And even just from a quantitative point of view, it's very different experience. So in Sophia, the first year, when we started with Michele Di Beni, we had 20 students, after which the number of students was even less. And so the way that we would interact in small groups is much easier. So, however, I would say that, let's say like this, because Sophia changed me, even in the way of being a teacher and a professor. The first year I remember very well, and I think there's here Don Patrizio, there's other people who were the first students who made up this first group. And I remember very well the first day of lessons that we did the pact, the oath, educational pact, after which, returning to my university, from that year onwards, I've always done that pact with all of my groups, even if they were big or small. There are always good groups. I mean, saying like this isn't good, but there are other groups that were perhaps less good. But in all of these, and I've always, on the first day of lessons, done this pact. Obviously translated, I can't do it in the same way that I did at Sophia. But I tried also to do it in a way to translate it into that, in a way that maybe was actually taken on by those students and welcomed by my students at my university. So I'd say that it changed me in my way of relating myself to my students, and it enriched me. The way of doing experience of my students at my university also enriched me from when I returned to Sophia. So we're talking about this reciprocity, which Professor Milan was talking about, this filial rapport between father and child, and His Excellency His Excellency Zani. There's always this dynamic, this between of reflexivity between these experiences. So between being a professor in these two different universities, the thing that burns me inside, and every time even more, because sometimes you have to do things in a rush to do things in time, it burns from inside of me this desire to make Sophia, to make other universities also become Sophia. So talking to other professors and in Spain, this is also perhaps our purpose, to make these instruments of Sophia arrive in the other universities. Sorry that I took a bit too much time, and I see I have forgotten. I've become immersed in this world of Sophia. So thank you very much to Professor Araceli for this response, and also for this for sharing this experience at Sophia and at your universities. So now I would give the word to Patricia, who would like to intervene and has 2 questions to ask. Yes. So the first question I want to present to His Excellency. So thank you very much for the presentation of the thought of Chiara. And in regards to the pedagogy, if both Professor Milan and Araceli, all 3 have been very clear. The first question that I would like to propose is, from a historical perspective, how was the concept, the awareness of Chiara born to give this light to the world of education? And to the Professor Araceli, John Paul II, talked to Chiara about the female gender. Is there a resonance of this in the thought of Chiara? Okay. So it's a nice question, and would also be in need of a deeper study. But knowing a little bit the history of Chiara, I think you can see the interesting passes. And above all, Chiara is a teacher. She did studies to be a teacher, so she has a personal experience. and a sensibility, I would say, above all, when she recounts how she puts in dialogue her students when she was up above in the castle where she was far away from Trent, and she had to work with a young and poor. You already see from there, you already see what the pedagogy of Chiara is. It's a practice which really came in the blood of Chiara. So it seems to me that the experience that she did from a disciple to the word, I think this is very important. She discovered the word, and this she puts herself into totally listening to that word, which she did with her companions. And the Chiara, it's really an extraordinary experience of listening to a teacher. So in this phase of 6 years, from 43 to 49, 1949, experienced in a total radical listening of the word, the gospel. This has been an extraordinary path in the life of Chiara. So in the moment of 1944, there were these particular illuminations, and the conscience and awareness that this light wasn't for her, and that it must be revealed to the others. And so there we see the beginning in the 49 and afterwards, a search for how to transmit this light to the movement, which was growing. And above all, there was a very beautiful writing from 1957. Above all, it was in Italy, but also in other countries, from a certain point of view, starting from the experience of Don Bosco, does a lecture to the whole movement present in Italy, where she says, this year has to be the year of education. We have to live education. We have to color our lives, to use educational terms, of education, with education, because education is fundamental. Chiara understood the extraordinary experience and perspective for the future, need to communicate what she had experienced, and this became very strong. And then ahead, after the approval of the movement, when Chiara makes the inundations were born, the branches, which all grew ever, and which always have the core of the charism. But then in the different worlds with economy and sociology, how can we say, in law, so there's a whole world of different disciplines that can be illuminated by wisdom, which comes from the other. This seems a bit the itinerary, the path of Chiara, which already in itself would have to be an interesting paradigm, which is not only the personal experience of Chiara, but within the personal experience of Chiara, there's a model which we can understand as pedagogical. Thank you very much. And so we'll pass the word to Professor Araceli. So thank you. Thank you for the words. The question, I had never thought of this fact before, but without, above all, you can't negate that in Chiara, the female gender, certainly, I'm certain that there will be this pedagogy that we can extract from this, of this charism. I can't say that I have the elements. I haven't studied or even thought of this, but thinking of this question, it comes to me a certainty that opens a beautiful path of study, a great challenge that we could study in the future, to extract this role of the female gender So I'd say this isn't just something that we apply to women or to the females, but to everybody. Thank you. So thank you to Professor Araceli, and thanks to everybody for these lovely questions. And I'm sorry for having to interrupt. And, as we propose dialogue and creativity, but unfortunately, time has run out does run out when we have dialogues. So I thank all of the collaborators and our public, everybody for listening and for their wonderful questions that arrived. And I would ask them to respond via the mail, global, and through using this email, we can stay in contact, which will be shared. So at this point, we'd like to close this first webinar, asking a final word, conclusive word from our speakers and our director. To you the word, and to our translators. So 2 quick points. This is Professor Milan. I first talked of actualization. Actualization today also has very closely with the words of Pope Francis. One of them was said before. The care of the created, of the creature. The second word, often neglected today, of creation, care of creation, sorry. So Wim Wenders, his words, which is this word of beauty. We have to rediscover the importance of beauty, so of art and artists in our world. I believe that education has, together with everything else, the need to rediscover and recuperate beauty. Thank you. So Professor Araceli. So I'll take the word and then we'll close. So I would simply like to thank everybody. So from when we began to now, to me, many new challenges have been opened up to go in more depth, to investigate. So listening to Professor Milan, His Excellency Zani, thinking that every word we can expand on even more so. So thinking if we can have texts. So it's been, because it's been very enriching. So perhaps if we can have something written, and there's a need to work on this and to keep on going ahead in this project. As His Excellency Dani said, to open ever more so the educational proposal of Sophia. Thank you to each person. So it's difficult to conclude this very intense encounter, but I touch on what the Professor said earlier, that I touched on the educational pact, because I didn't want to occupy this half an hour with a theme it's very much at the heart of the Pope, but I think it's appropriate to call forth. So talking of Pedagogia of Communion and of the person and community can only retake us back to that which Pope Francis launched some years ago, to reconstruct a global pact, a global education pact. And so on this, then Pope Francis has done 6 or 7 courses. So there's a lot of material with many different points, and which Pope Francis launches to everybody. He invites everybody to be part of this. And so Sophia, which it's already did last month, it's really important that we're in the first line, because this educational pact is translated into 5 macro areas of study, which are areas of study that would have to help us, says Pope Francis, to respond to the educational catastrophe that we're living in this moment, he says. And this is a terminology that's maybe a little strong, but in reality, there is a catastrophe. With we see in the newspapers and whatnot. So we've chosen these 5 areas, which are human dignity and law, education responds to laws and rights, fraternity and cooperation, like global, international cooperation, ecology and integral ecology, 4th, peace and citizenship, and 5th, culture and religion. These are 5 macro areas which the pedagogical sciences have to occupy itself with. We have to, and so here I close indicating what Paul VI already said. So from the Laudato Si, so Pope Francis said 2 months ago, talking about the Global Education Pact, if we want to look about this fundamental, this global pact, we have to look at the social doctrine of the church. So it's a new phase of the social doctrine of the church, comes from Paul VI, Milanovic, 1960s. We have to educate the whole man, the whole human, every human, every person. It's an integral, universal education. We have to, in order to do so, we have to overcome 3 big difficulties. First, a big poverty of thought. We need to educate people to think, because we think a little, and we think badly. So we have to educate our rationality. Secondly, we have to refer to an anthropology which is strong and solid, not just generic and relativistic. Third, unfortunately, we find ourselves in front of a great lack of fraternity. We need to construct fraternity. We need a pedagogy of communion. So pedagogy, according to our vision, so it's an education to construct a new world. I believe that this is important to dedicate ourselves in this direction, which are then important and fundamental points of the global compact on education. Thank you very much. And so we'll pass the word to Director Giuseppe Argiolis. So the closing remarks cannot be anything but words of gratitude for what we have experienced in this classroom with a capital C, to say in the style that we want to live at Sophia, in this active listening and reciprocity and intergenerationality. So the first word is gratitude, and the second word is sort of dedication and task. So we've had some challenges have been proposed to us also for the life of Sophia that we need to develop, and which we'll talk about ahead. A challenge that we're called to live with joy, because it can really give an important contribution for our current and contemporary society, in dialogue with all of the reality with which we are in contact. As Pope Francis said, this importance to make networks, to work together with the others. So we want to do that also, us to be in contact with the academic reality, but also with the lived reality of the world. And I think this center of studies that we want to construct at Sophia, but exactly to give a contribution of also of the new generations, but also in dialogue with all of the other disciplines, to have this dialogue with all of these disciplines that are present at Sophia, because there's a need to grow and to have this growth by having this interdisciplinary and also from the pedagogy and educational field. So thank you to everybody for all of the points that you've brought forward. And thank you to everyone for making this webinar possible, for the staff, for their dedication, and giving me the possibility to realize this, and for everybody that has been present here to listen, and for listening to the words that have been presented. So thank you very much. So we've arrived at the conclusion of this webinar, which seems to me to truly respond to the invitation of Pope Francis and of our academic community to develop wisdom and to always be going out. So this is a new occasion to listen, to be in dialogue. So I would like to thank again our director, Giuseppe Lajalis, His Excellency Cenzo Mazzani, Professor Acciari and Professor Milan, and thanking the staff, the translators, and our public, our audience. So I would remind that our next webinar will be the 27th of March, where our speakers will accompany us on a new, the next step in this process. So thank you again for having followed.